In this video, I'm going to take you through how UA audio interfaces like Apollo and Aero work with Ableton Live on a Windows computer. I'm using an Aero to demonstrate, but the concepts apply to all desktop and rack mount Apollos as well. Before we begin, be sure you've installed the UAD software and firmware updates and registered your interface at uaudio.com so you're ready to follow along. Apollo and Aero let you hear yourself complete with onboard UAD effects in real time, all the time, with no latency, because it's all done in the interface, not on the host computer. And the keys to this true low-latency recording and monitoring system are onboard UAD2 processing and the console application. Console runs alongside Ableton and handles all your audio monitoring. It lets you set up your inputs and headphone mixes easily. And you can record yourself through UAD emulations of vintage mic preamps, compressors, EQs, reverbs, or guitar amps with no latency, just like if you were using an analog studio. Console replaces the software monitoring feature in Ableton, so be sure to disable the software monitoring preference when using an Aero or Apollo. In Console, all physical and virtual inputs are shown as channel strips. Channel strips are routed directly to the monitor output, so you hear sound as soon as you plug in an input. You use Console's faders and other controls to create your input mix, but the audio recorded in Ableton is sent at full level before the faders. With universal audio interfaces, onboard DSPs run the mixer and UAD plugins. Interfaces come complete with a basic set of great-sounding plugins right in the box, which include the 610B tube preamp, the LA2A and 1176 compressors, and the Marshall Plexi Classic guitar amp. You track through them with no latency by adding them to channel strips in the console. You can choose to record with or without effects by toggling the Insert Effects buttons. When set to record, effects will be recorded, and when set to monitor, you'll hear the effects but they won't be recorded. You can set this up channel by channel or all at once using the global Insert Effects buttons on the side panel. And when you're ready to mix, you can use the same UAD plugins directly in Ableton. Just be sure to disable anything you're not using in Console to get the most out of your DSP. Unison preamps like the 610B and the Marshall are placed in a special insert slot at the top of the channel. They can be used in any channel insert, but when you use the special Unison slot, they take over the physical preamps to complete the hardware model by changing the impedance and gain staging. And because of this unique hardware-software interaction, Unison preamps are always recorded, regardless of the state of the Insert Effects buttons. The Settings page is where you edit and save hardware and software options. The default settings are a great starting point, but you can customize them at any time, and you may want to set input delay compensation to off for the lowest latency. Ableton Live uses ASIO for communicating with audio interfaces, and Console's unique I/O matrix allows you to customize the driver for your Apollo or Aero. Start by setting it to default. Default lists all of the inputs and outputs on the interface, which you can then reorder to suit your needs. When you're done, you can store them as a preset. Note that when working at high sample rates, the I/O configuration changes, and some channels are disabled. Be sure to refer to the software manual for a complete list of driver tables. There are a few basic ways to set up your headphone mixes. The simplest way is to set the cue source to mix. Then everything you hear in the speakers is routed to the built-in headphone outputs, and you control the overall volume with the dedicated knobs on your interface. You can also create discrete headphone mixes using Console sends for your live audio tracks and Ableton sends for your individual DAW tracks. You do this by setting the cue source to HP or Q and using Console headphone sends and Ableton sends routed to the headphone output to create your mix. Now launch Ableton Live. First, we'll load the audio driver. From the Options menu, scroll down and select Preferences. In the Preferences pane, open the Audio tab and select ASIO as the driver type and Universal Audio Thunderbolt as the audio device. Now you can access channel configuration and hardware setup for your interface. The first time you install UAD software, you have to set a Custom Vst Folder in Ableton. Go to Preferences and select the File Folders tab. Under Plugin Sources, click Browse, then navigate to C, Program Files, Steinberg, VST Plugins, and select Open. Once you select the folder, Ableton Live will scan the plugins and make them ready for use, and the Use VST Custom Folder button turns on. In Ableton Live, inputs and outputs are shown as numbered lists. Ableton doesn't allow you to rename the I/O. However, you can refer to the I/O matrix to help you remember which number corresponds to the I/O. Inputs and outputs can be configured as mono or stereo, and for ease of use, you should probably create both. Deactivating unused inputs and outputs reduces the CPU load if needed. When you create a new audio track, it defaults to EXT-IN1, which is Apollo or Arrow's channel 1. You can select a different input from the pop-up list in the Input chooser. New tracks are automatically routed to the master output, which is Arrow and Apollo's monitor left-right output by default. To route your audio to a different output, select EXT out and then select the output pair you wish to use. With Apollo and Arrow, your DAW buffer size doesn't really matter because the hardware handles all real-time audio processing and monitoring without relying on the host computer. The hardware buffer size determines how much latency occurs when looping audio through Ableton. If you want to play virtual instruments inside Ableton, set the I/O buffer to a low setting, like 64 or 32 samples. Low buffers use more of the computer's power to minimize latency, but it makes instruments easier to play. Of course, this does reduce track count. For mixing, you can set the hardware buffer high so that the computer has more horsepower to dedicate to the mixing engine. You'll have to experiment to find the best settings for your computer and your workflow, but a good starting point here is 128 samples. When you monitor your audio through Ableton Live, you'll encounter latency due to buffering, which is usually not a great recording experience. Apollo and Arrow let you avoid that input latency altogether by replacing Ableton's software monitor with live audio direct from the interface, controlled by the console application. Simply set the track's monitor state to off. Then you'll only hear the record-enabled track while it's playing back, and it gets muted as soon as you punch in. Ableton Live automatically sends the session sample rate to the internal clock. When you're not using Ableton, you can change the sample rate for other audio applications with the pop-up menu at the bottom of the mixer window or in hardware settings. Apollo and Arrow have a number of virtual channels, which are connections that let you route the audio from applications on your computer to channel strips in the console, and vice versa. For example, you can route Ableton's master output to a pair of virtual channels instead of the main monitor. This makes it easier to blend live sources with DAW playback right in the console using faders. To map the master output to Virtual 1 and 2 on Arrow, set the stereo output of the master to 3 and 4, which is console of Virtual 1 and 2. Then in console, link Virtual 1 and 2 to create a stereo fader and give it a custom name. For desktop and rack mount Apollo systems, note the number of the output pair you want to use and set the master to that pair. In addition to making it easier to mix your live inputs with DAW playback, you get 2 great headphone mix options for free when you route Ableton's output to virtual channels. You can set the cue source to mix and use the main console mix. That's easy. Or you can set the cue source to HP or Q and use channel strip sends to create a separate mix for the headphones. You can use your Arrow or Apollo for system sounds like browsers and music applications. To do so, right-click on the speaker icon in the tray and select Playback Device. Just select your audio interface and you're good to go. By default, system sounds are routed directly to mon left and right, but you can route them to virtual channels on the console. Simply open the I/O matrix and set outputs 1 and 2 to Virtual 1 and 2, and then link the channels to create a stereo fader. Now all your audio appears on a channel strip, and you can use UAD plugins to make them sound great. Note that Windows uses 2 separate audio systems, WDM to handle system sounds and ASIO to handle DAWs. The 2 systems must use the same sample rate to avoid pops, clicks, and other artifacts. And note that some programs can't share audio resources, so some applications may not work together. You'll find more information and current software at help.uaudio.com. And thanks for watching.